Sometime between midnight and dawn on May 3rd, 2003, a 40-foot granite face that had watched over Franconia Notch for 12,000 years fell from Cannon Mountain. Nobody saw it happen. The old man of the mountain, the profile on New Hampshire's license plates, highway signs, and state quarter, ceased to exist while the state slept. That face had drawn millions of visitors to mountains that were, for a century, the most famous vacation destination in America. 30 grand hotels, the richest families on the eastern seaboard. And then, one by one, almost everything they built burned to the ground. The strange part is that the White Mountains didn't become famous because they were beautiful. They became famous because 9 people died. In August of 1826, a family named Willie, Samuel, his wife Polly, their 5 children, and 2 hired men, lived in a small house deep inside Crawford Notch, a narrow valley slicing through the center of the mountains. They had come to the Notch hoping to make a living as innkeepers, serving farmers hauling goods between Vermont and the coast of Maine. That summer had been brutally dry. The mountain soil had turned to powder. And then, on the night of August 28th, the most violent rainstorm anyone in the region had ever seen tore through the Notch. The Saco River rose 20 feet overnight. Livestock floated downstream. Boulders the size of houses broke free from the slopes. A massive landslide ripped down the mountainside directly above the Willie house. The family fled. They ran from their home toward a stone shelter Samuel had built weeks earlier, after a smaller slide in June had terrified them. They never made it. The landslide killed all 9 of them. Here is the detail that turned a local disaster into a national sensation. The house survived. A large boulder embedded in the hillside behind it split the debris around the building like water around a rock. The landslide destroyed everything in its path, except the place the Willies had abandoned. When rescuers arrived, they found the front door open, beds unmade, clothes scattered on the floor, an open Bible on the kitchen table, as though the family had stepped out for a moment and would return. They did not return. Rescuers found the bodies of Samuel and Polly Willie, 2 of their daughters, and the 2 hired hands. They never found the other 3 children. The story spread through newspapers across the country with a speed that few disasters of that era achieved. Ministers used it in sermons about the inscrutable will of God. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote a short story about it called The Ambitious Guest. Theodore Dwight put it in his guidebook, The Northern Traveler, which was read by tens of thousands. But it was a painter who did the most lasting damage. Thomas Cole, the founder of the Hudson River School, the first uniquely American school of landscape painting, traveled to Crawford Notch and produced a canvas called Distant View of the Slide That Destroyed the Willie Family. The painting showed the Notch as it truly was, violent, beautiful, carved by a force that no human decision could have stopped. And the paintings that followed from other artists drawn to the mountains did something no one quite intended. They made the White Mountains look irresistible, terrifying, sublime, dangerous, and therefore necessary to see. In the decades before the Willies died, most Americans had regarded the White Mountains as formless masses of rock that blocked travel routes and contained nothing of value or interest. After the tragedy, they couldn't stay away. The Boston Globe later wrote that the slide convinced the public that the White Mountains preserved nature in its original, potent state. Tourists began arriving within months. By the fall of 1826, hundreds of visitors were making the journey to Crawford Notch to see the place where the family had died. Samuel Wiley's own brother, the Reverend Benjamin Wiley, charged admission for guided tours of the house. By 1845, a tourism entrepreneur named Horace Fabian had turned the Wiley house into a 50-room hotel. Americans were paying to sleep in the building that a dead family had fled. For generations afterward, locals used the phrase, "It gives you the willies," to describe a feeling of dread, especially while traveling through Crawford Notch on a dark night. And it was the Crawford family, the people who had settled this place a generation before the Willies, the family that would give the Notch its name, who first figured out that there was money in these mountains. Abel Crawford arrived in the White Mountains around 1792 with his wife Hannah and moved into a log cabin near what is now Bretton Woods. His father-in-law, Eleazar Rosebrook, settled nearby. Together, they began taking in travelers, farmers passing through the Notch on their way to market in Portland. There was only one road through the mountains, and it was terrible, and anyone using it needed a place to sleep. The Crawfords became innkeepers almost by accident. Abel's son, Ethan Allen Crawford, grew into a man of extraordinary size and energy. In 1819, Ethan and his father cut a trail to the summit of Mount Washington, the tallest peak in the northeastern United States, 6,288 feet above sea level, so they could guide paying customers to the top. That trail, the Crawford Path, is still in use. It is the oldest continuously maintained hiking trail in America. Ethan charged visitors for the climb and housed them in his tavern afterward. He was, in a meaningful sense, the first man to turn the White Mountains into a business. But the mountains consumed him. In 1833, Ethan was thrown from his horse on Cherry Mountain Road and suffered internal injuries he never fully recovered from. Debts accumulated. Creditors took his farm and tavern. He and Lucy retreated to Vermont. He returned one last time to the notch that bore his name and died there in 1846. By then, the world he had created was already outgrowing him. The painters had arrived. Not just Thomas Cole, but Albert Bierstadt, John Frederick Kensett, Asher Durand, Sanford Gifford, and eventually more than 400 artists who would comprise what historians now call the White Mountain School of Art. They fanned out across the mountains with their easels and set up in hotel lobbies, on rocky ledges, beside waterfalls. Frank Henry Shapley served as the artist-in-residence at the Crawford House for 16 consecutive years, from 1877 to 1893, painting the view from the veranda, the notch in autumn light, the storms rolling over the presidential range. His studio still stands near the site of the hotel he outlived. The paintings these artists produced hung in galleries in New York and Boston and Philadelphia, and created for the first time a visual vocabulary for the American wilderness. Kensett's 1851 painting of Mount Washington from the Valley of Conway did more for White Mountain tourism than any advertisement ever could. People who had never left the city wanted to see what the painters had seen. They wanted to stand where Cole had stood and feel what his canvas seemed to contain. The terrible beauty of a landscape that could kill you and still make you wish you hadn't left. And then the railroads came. By the 1850s, tracks reached into the White Mountain region, and suddenly a landscape that had taken days to reach from Boston or New York could be accessed in hours. The remoteness that had once made these mountains forbidding now made them exclusive, and exclusivity was exactly what the wealthy wanted. The Grand Hotel era had begun. These were not ordinary hotels. The first substantial ones appeared in the 1830s and 1840s, but by the 1850s they were being built on an almost absurd scale. The Crawford House at the head of Crawford Notch could accommodate 400 guests. The Profile House in Franconia Notch grew from a simple 3.5-story building in 1853 to a sprawling complex of 20 interconnected cottages with capacity for 600. The Glen House sat at the base of the Mount Washington Auto Road. The Fabian House, built by Sylvester Marsh near Bretton Woods, had a parlor measuring 3,500 square feet and a dining room that could seat the population of some New Hampshire towns. Each of these hotels was essentially a self-contained village. They were built in areas with no infrastructure, no electrical grid, no municipal water, no nearby farms. So they created their own. Each hotel kept stables. Some operated greenhouses and raised their own livestock. Some had fish ponds to supply the kitchen. Some generated their own gas for lighting and, later, their own electricity. At least one had a printing shop to produce daily menus for the guests. Every employee, every maid, every cook, every stable hand lived on the premises for the season. And the season was everything. These hotels operated only in summer, roughly June through September. Families arrived from Boston and New York and Philadelphia by train, bringing steamer trunks and servants and nannies and wardrobes for every possible occasion. They stayed for weeks, sometimes the entire summer. Each morning, a maid brought tea to your room. Each evening, you changed clothes for dinner, and you had packed different outfits for morning, afternoon, and evening, because this was a place where being seen was half the point. Between meals, you sat on a 400-foot veranda and watched the mountains do nothing at all, and it was perfect. Presidents came. Warren Harding played the Mountain Views golf course. Ulysses Grant visited the Profile House. The hotels published daily arrival lists so that guests could see who else was in the mountains and arrange introductions. This was networking disguised as vacation, deal-making dressed up as leisure. The White Mountains, in their golden age, were not just a resort. They were one of the most important social stages in America. At the peak of the industry, roughly 1885 to 1910, there were approximately 200 hotels, inns, and boarding houses in the White Mountains, each accommodating 40 or more guests. Nearly 12,000 people could be housed at any one time. Of the larger establishments, about 30 qualified as truly grand, meaning 200 beds or more, with parlors, ballrooms, orchestras, tennis courts, and golf courses. There were also things money could not buy anywhere else. The air, for instance. In an era when cities like Boston and New York sweltered under coal smoke and horse manure and the ever-present threat of cholera, the White Mountains offered something that a certain class of American understood as a medical necessity: clean air and cold water. Doctors prescribed summer stays in the mountains the way they later prescribed antibiotics. And there was the newspaper. In 1874, a Massachusetts journalist named Henry Burt got stranded overnight in a storm on the summit of Mount Washington. Bored out of his mind, he decided there ought to be a newspaper up there for people waiting for the clouds to clear. 3 years later, he arranged for a Campbell cylinder press to be hauled by cog railway to the summit and installed inside the old Tip-Top House, a stone building at 6,288 feet. The paper was called Among the Clouds, and it became one of the most improbable publishing ventures in American history. Burt printed the names of guests arriving on the morning train so they could buy a souvenir copy on their way down in the afternoon. He put visitors to work typesetting. In its second issue, he announced that any visitor who could not set type was welcome to exercise after their climb by turning the wheel of the press. Eventually, 3 reporters covered news from the entire White Mountain region. By 1908, the paper was printing 2 editions a day from the highest newspaper office in the eastern United States. That same year, a fire on the summit destroyed what people had taken to calling the city among the clouds: the Summit House Hotel, the signal station, the newspaper office, nearly everything up there. Everything except the Tip-Top House, which was built of stone and refused to burn. It had survived since 1853. It would survive everything that came after. Fire is the recurring nightmare of this story. These grand hotels were made of wood, enormous wooden structures filled with gas lamps and coal stoves, standing in remote mountain locations with no fire departments. And they burned. They burned with a regularity that seems, in hindsight, almost inevitable. The original Crawford House burned in 1859. It was rebuilt and expanded. The Fabian House burned during construction in 1868, was rebuilt in 1873, and burned again, for good, in 1951. The Kearsarge House in North Conway burned in 1917. The Glen House burned and was rebuilt 4 separate times between 1851 and 1967. 4 times. 4 different hotels on the same site, each destroyed by fire. But the hotels were not only fighting fire. They were fighting something they could not see coming and would not have believed even if they had. Consider Sylvester Marsh. He was a New Hampshire farm boy who left for Boston at 19, made a fortune in the meatpacking business in Chicago, lost it in the Panic of 1837, made another fortune in grain, and then, in 1852, nearly died in a storm while climbing Mount Washington. He came down from that mountain with an idea that most people considered insane. He would build a railroad to the summit. When Marsh presented his plan to the New Hampshire legislature in 1858, the lawmakers gave him a charter, but not because they believed it would work. Local tradition says they voted yes on the theory that since the project was clearly impossible, there was no harm in approving it. One legislator reportedly suggested they also grant him permission to extend the railroad to the moon. Marsh put up $5,000 of his own money and started building in 1866. The first train reached the summit on July 3, 1869. The Mount Washington Cog Railway was the first mountain climbing cog railway in the world. Over 3 miles long, with an average grade of 1 foot in 4, held to the mountain by a toothed wheel and ratchet system that Marsh patented himself. It cost $139,500 to build. Marsh also built the Fabian House Hotel at the base to accommodate the tourists his railroad would deliver. The man who nearly died on that mountain turned it into both a mechanical marvel and a profit center. But here is the detail worth remembering. While Marsh was building his railroad to the summit, another man was building something very different at the base. James Everell Henry was a lumber baron. Starting around 1880, he moved into the Zeeland Valley, a stretch of virgin forest just west of Crawford Notch, and began systematically cutting it down. He built a company town, homes, a sawmill, 5 charcoal kilns, 2 railroad stations, a school, a company store. At its peak, Zeeland had 250 workers. Henry owned every building. He served as postmaster, assessor, tax collector, and judge. On the back of employee passes, he had printed, "A good man can find work here. A poor man better not show up." He stripped the Zeeland Valley bare. Newspaper editors called him a wood butcher. His methods were described as frightful slaughter. He was known as the Grand Duke of the Duchy of Lincoln. None of this bothered him. When the trees were gone, the slash, the branches, the stumps, the wastewood, dried in the summer heat. In 1886, a forest fire swept through the valley and destroyed much of what remained. Henry did not rebuild. He moved his operation deeper into the mountains, to Lincoln, and started over. In Lincoln, he and his 3 sons ruled autocratically. They owned every building but one. They served as postmasters, assessors, selectmen, tax collectors, and judges. They hired and fired the school teachers. In 1897, fire consumed what was left of Zeeland. The town vanished completely. There is a story, it may be embellished, but it captures the man, that when the Mount Washington Hotel was being planned across the valley, Henry offered to sell the mountain he owned facing the proposed site. The hotel company refused his price. Henry told them he would put up charcoal kilns and burn every tree on the mountain. The hotel company paid what he asked. Henry took the money and left. Today, hikers on the Zeeland Trail walk over the old railroad bed that once served Henry's operation. They pass through forest that looks ancient, untouched, primeval. It isn't. Every tree they see is younger than 130 years. An 1893 article in the New York Times carried the headline, "Devastating the White Mountains." The Forest Service warned that the timber barons were destroying the business of 1,100 inns and hotels in the mountains. In 1903 alone, 9 major fires burned 85,000 acres. In some places, the fires were so intense, they vaporized the topsoil. Ash fell into nearby towns. Streams silted up. The headwaters of 4 major rivers, the Saco, the Androscoggin, the Merrimack, and the Connecticut, were fouled by sediment. Floods blamed on the logging devastation reached as far downstream as Lowell, Massachusetts. And here is the irony that nobody planned. The logging crisis helped save the mountains. An unlikely coalition: hikers, hotel owners, artists, women's clubs, politicians, paper companies that realized they were destroying their own raw material, came together and pushed for federal protection. A Massachusetts congressman named John Wingate Weeks, who had grown up in Lancaster, New Hampshire, watching the timber barons work, introduced legislation to allow the federal government to buy private land to protect eastern watersheds. It was not an easy fight. Western congressmen did not want to share federal conservation dollars with the East. Constitutional lawyers argued the government had no authority to purchase private land for forests. Congress rejected more than 40 similar bills before Weeks finally found a legal argument that worked. He framed the purchases as protecting the headwaters of navigable rivers, which brought it under the Commerce Clause. When devastating fires in the West killed 85 people and burned 3 million acres in 1910, the political resistance finally broke. The Weeks Act of 1911 created the legal framework for the White Mountain National Forest, one of the first national forests east of the Mississippi. The Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests, founded in 1901 by 8 people alarmed at the clear-cutting, had pushed for over a decade to make it happen. Today, the forest covers nearly 800,000 acres. The mountains that J.E. Henry stripped bare are covered in trees again. The mountains were saved, but the grand hotels were not. Consider the last great gamble. In the late 1890s, a man named Joseph Stickney, a New Hampshire native who had made a fortune in coal before he turned 30, decided to build the most spectacular hotel the White Mountains had ever seen. He already owned the Mount Pleasant House in Bretton Woods, but he wanted something bigger, something that would announce itself as a destination worth crossing an ocean for. He hired the architect Charles Alling Gifford, recommended to him by Henry Flagler, the man who had built the Florida hotel empire. Gifford designed a massive Spanish Renaissance revival structure, the red roof meant to evoke the tile roofs of Spain, with more than 2,000 doors, 1,200 windows, 11 miles of plumbing, 900 kegs of nails, and room for the kind of guests who traveled with their own servants. 250 Italian craftsmen were brought in and housed in dormitories on the property. They used construction techniques that belonged to an older world: hand-fitted ironwork, plaster moldings, hardwood paneling that would have been at home in a European palace. The project cost $1.7 million, more than $50 million today. Of the 30 grand resort hotels built in the White Mountains between 1850 and 1930, the Mount Washington Hotel was the only one designed and constructed as a single, unified building from the start. Every other grand hotel had been assembled piecemeal, a wing here, an addition there, growing organically with demand. Stickney built his as though he already knew on the first day of construction exactly how large it needed to be. This is worth pausing on, because Stickney was building his monument at exactly the moment the era that justified it was beginning to end. The year 1902 was the tail end of the Gilded Age. The forces that would undo the grand hotel system, the automobile, the income tax, prohibition, the slow democratization of American leisure, were already in motion. He may have sensed it. The hotel opened in July 1902. On opening day, Stickney stood in the lobby of the largest and most expensive building ever erected in the White Mountains and told the gathered press something that sounded like a joke, but may have been the most honest sentence he ever spoke. He said, "Look at me, for I am the poor fool who built all this." He was dead before the next Christmas, a stroke in New York City on December 21st, 1903. He was in his early 60s. He had enjoyed his creation for exactly one full season. His much younger wife, Carolyn Foster Stickney, inherited the hotel and ran it for the next 3 decades. In 1913, she married a French aristocrat and became a princess. She kept running the hotel anyway. She died in 1936, and the property passed to her nephew, Foster Reynolds. He closed it in 1942 during the war. And then something happened that Joseph Stickney could not possibly have imagined. In 1944, a Boston syndicate purchased the property for $450,000, a fraction of what it had cost to build. And the U.S. government, looking for a remote, secure, easily controllable location to host an international conference on the post-war financial order, chose the Mount Washington Hotel. On July 1st, 1944, 730 delegates from 44 nations arrived in Bretton Woods. The government had chosen the Mount Washington Hotel for specific reasons. Its remoteness made security manageable. The scenery was meant to put delegates in a generous mood. And there was a political favor involved. The Republican senator from New Hampshire, Charles Tobey, faced a tough re-election campaign, and the Treasury Secretary wanted his support. The hotel had been closed for 2 years. The staff had barely a month to get it ready. For 3 chaotic weeks, while the war still raged across Europe and the Pacific, D-Day had happened just weeks earlier, John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White negotiated the architecture of the post-war global economy in a building designed for lawn tennis and afternoon tea. One was a Cambridge aristocrat who had already been present at the Treaty of Versailles. The other was the son of Lithuanian Jewish immigrants from working-class Boston. One of them, it would later emerge, was a Soviet spy. Boy Scouts carried microphones from speaker to speaker in the grand ballroom. Committees met around the clock. The plumbing, designed for summer guests, could not keep up with 700 people running hot water at the same time. What came out of those 3 weeks was the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The Bretton Woods system, the agreement that pegged the world's currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold, would govern international finance for nearly 3 decades. It was, depending on whom you ask, either the foundation of post-war prosperity or the beginning of a system that concentrated wealth in ways the world is still dealing with. Either way, the global financial order as it existed for the rest of the 20th century was designed inside a hotel that a dead coal magnate had built to impress summer vacationers. The gold room where the final documents were signed still exists. There is a plaque on the door. The chairs are still arranged as they were in July 1944. But that conference was the last great event in a story that had been winding down for a generation. The automobile had arrived after World War I, and it changed everything. Not by making the mountains less accessible, but by making them too accessible and in the wrong way. The car democratized travel, which sounds like progress, until you realize what it did to an industry built on exclusivity. Cars brought tourists who didn't stay for weeks. They didn't bring steamer trunks and servants. They didn't need orchestras and formal dining rooms and 400-foot verandas. They stopped at tourist homes, roadside camps, tea houses. They wanted to drive through the mountains, stop for a photograph, eat lunch at a picnic table, and keep going. The average visit shortened from weeks to days. The revenue model that had sustained these enormous wooden structures collapsed. The income tax ate at the fortunes of the families who had been the hotel's most reliable customers. Prohibition killed the bar revenue. The Great Depression finished off whatever was left of the clientele. And then there was the simple mechanical problem. These were summer-only operations, open 4 months a year, trying to earn 12 months of maintenance costs in a season that was getting shorter and less profitable every year. One by one they closed, and those that survived the economics did not survive the fire. The Profile House, the 600-room palace in Franconia Notch with its 20 connected cottages, burned on August 2nd, 1923, at the peak of its season. The fire moved so fast that all that remained was the train depot. The Crawford House, which had survived fires in 1859 and continued operating for over a century, finally closed in 1975. It sat empty for 2 years. Vandals broke in. Squatters used it for shelter. The windows were shattered, the floors ripped up, the grass uncut. On the evening of November 20th, 1977, it burned. The fire was almost certainly set deliberately. Where it once stood, the Appalachian Mountain Club now operates the Highland Center. The only surviving structure from the original Crawford House complex is the railroad depot, which was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1982. Of the roughly 24 grand hotels that once operated in the White Mountains, 5 survive today. The Mount Washington Hotel, now owned by Omni Hotels, is the most famous. There is also the Mountain View Grand in Whitefield, which was owned and operated by a single family, the Dodges, for 113 years before it closed in 1986, sat derelict for over a decade, and was eventually restored. The Eagle Mountain House and the Wentworth in Jackson are still open. The Balsams in Dixville Notch has been closed for years, waiting for a developer to decide whether to gamble on it. 5 out of 24. And the mountains themselves are different now. The painters are gone, the orchestras are gone, the private rail cars and the steamer trunks and the weeks-long stays are gone. The newspaper that was printed at 6,288 feet is gone. The company towns that the loggers built are gone. Even the forest that covers the mountains is, in geological terms, brand new, regrowth from the devastation of 130 years ago. Almost nothing you see in the White Mountains today is as old as it looks. And the old man of the mountain is gone. On that night in May 2003, a storm rolled through Franconia Notch. The clouds were low. Nobody could see the profile on Cannon Mountain. At some point during the night, nobody knows exactly when, the 5 granite ledges that had formed the face for 12,000 years lost their hold. 40 feet of rock, somewhere between 2,000 and 7,000 tons, depending on which geologist you ask. The formation had been held together in recent decades by turnbuckles and steel rods, but the granite itself had degraded over centuries of freezing and thawing. One raindrop too many, and it let go. When state park workers arrived the next morning and the clouds cleared, they saw only a blank cliff face. The profile that had been there every morning of their working lives was gone. There was nothing gradual about it, no warning, no slow erosion visible to the naked eye. One day it was there, and the next day it was rubble at the bottom of a cliff. A reporter compared it to Old Faithful suddenly stopping, or Thomas Jefferson falling off Mount Rushmore. Word spread through the state the way the Willie tragedy had spread nearly 2 centuries earlier. Fast, with disbelief, and with an undercurrent of grief that surprised even the people feeling it. The state set up an online memorial where people could share stories. One after another, they wrote about childhood road trips, first dates, anniversaries spent looking up at the old man. One woman wrote that she had always assumed her grandchildren would see it. She had taken it for granted. The state considered rebuilding the face. A committee determined it was not feasible. Instead, they built a memorial plaza at Profile Lake. If you stand in the right spot and look through a set of metal profile markers mounted on posts, you can align them against the cliff and see for a moment what used to be there. Daniel Webster once said of the old man, "Up in the mountains of New Hampshire, God Almighty has hung out a sign to show that there he makes men." Nathaniel Hawthorne said a story there. The image appeared on the state quarter in 2000, 3 years before the face fell. New Hampshire still uses it on its license plates and highway signs. The state emblem is a portrait of something that no longer exists. A geologist named Brian Fowler, who had first evaluated the old man's rock mechanics in 1976, said afterward that when the face was up there, it represented a kind of reliantly steady, reassuring presence in a world that was otherwise changing really rapidly. He was talking about the rock formation, but he could have been talking about the mountains themselves. The White Mountains had been the one constant in American tourism, the place that was there before Yellowstone, before the Grand Canyon, before Florida, before Las Vegas, before anywhere anyone went on purpose. For a century, this was the destination. This was where you proved you had made it. And then, piece by piece, everything that made it what it was, either burned or fell or was cut down or simply stopped being what people wanted. On the summit of Mount Washington, the Tip-Top House, the stone building where Henry Burt once hauled a printing press and published a daily newspaper at the top of the world, is still standing. It survived the fire of 1908. It survived the decades of neglect that followed. It is now a state historic site. You can walk inside. The stone walls are cold even in August. You can stand where the press stood and look out the same window and see the same view that 12,000 summer visitors a year once paid to see, back when this was the most famous mountaintop in America, back when there was a city up here. Down the mountain, the cog railway still runs. It has been climbing that track since 1869, the longest continuously operating mountain railway in the world. Sylvester Marsh's invention outlasted Sylvester Marsh, outlasted the Fabian house he built to feed guests, outlasted the era that made it necessary, and kept climbing anyway. The parking lot for the Cannon Mountain ski area sits on the ground where the Profile House once stood. 600 rooms, 20 cottages, a season's worth of guests. Now a flat stretch of pavement where people leave their cars before riding a tramway. The Crawford Path, the trail Ethan Allen Crawford and his father cut to the summit in 1819, is still open and still maintained. It is the oldest continuously used hiking trail in America. On a clear day in October, you can stand at its trailhead and look out at mountains covered in trees that all grew back from nothing, above a valley where a family once fled into a storm and never came home, beside a road where grand hotels once stretched as far as you could see, their verandas lit and their dining rooms full, the last trains of the evening pulling away into the dark.